بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين أما بعد. Inshallah, today we begin the station of al-azm, and azm is will, but a will that means to exert force to go towards something. And in light of this station, I'd like to just remind you all and myself of our intention, to refresh our intention that we are here to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This entire book revolves around the pursuit of coming closer to Allah, strengthening our relationship with Allah, making sure that it is healthy. And so I'd like to just remind you all and myself of this intention that we are here to seek the pleasure of Allah and come closer to Him bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And so, min manazil iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'een, manzilat al-azm, among the stations of iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'een. And that's another thing to remind ourselves with. We're just over halfway through the book. It's been a while. I think we've been doing this for 2 years now, but we're just over halfway, alhamdulillah. So let's remind ourselves again, the whole premise of this book is to understand that verse in the middle of Surah Al-Fatiha. And if you all remember, when we began this series, we said that this verse is the thesis of the Quran, meaning the entire Quran revolves around this: worshipping Allah and getting His help. And so everything in the Quran revolves around how to worship Allah and how to get Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's help. And we mentioned that another way to translate that is the following: iyyaka nasta'een, it is you who we seek help from. That is Allah's relationship with us. How does Allah relate to us? It is by helping us, providing us with the means for success, for protection, for happiness, for eternal bliss, and the list goes on. Our relationship to Allah is through ibadah, worship, right? And so to do that, we need to be people of azm. And azm is of two types. You have azm in regards to beginning this path. So azm we're talking about in the context of this book, not azm in the broader understanding of the term. The first type is to actually begin. You know, we are all human beings, we all experience life, and one of the major challenges of life is laziness and procrastination. Right? We know that getting something accomplished is really pleasurable to us. We know that, okay, if I go do this, I know by the end of the day, I'm going to feel good about myself. Right? But it's easier said than done. Not because the task itself is difficult, it might be very mundane, simple tasks. But getting the motivation to actually get up and go, that's where the challenge begins. And so we might say, you know what, staying up after Fajr in my experience is a lot more productive. There's a lot more blessings in life, and this is what the Prophet ﷺ teaches us. And you say, okay, tomorrow inshallah I'm going to begin this. I'm going to stay up from after Fajr. And you get up after Fajr, you're tired, you go back to sleep. And it might go years, might go by before you actually muster the azm to begin this. And so the first element, the first aspect of azm is to begin this path to Allah. The second side of this is when we are actually on the path, to continue on that path. Right? So that's the other challenge. And so the station revolves around really these two goals: how to begin that path to Allah, and how to maintain that pursuit of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's a general way of putting it, but we need to understand that we might be on the path towards Allah in one aspect of life, but in another aspect we have yet to begin it. So we might be people who pray 5 times a day, we fast Ramadan, we give our zakah, we've done our hajj, we stay away from the major sins, but tahajjud is also part of this path to Allah. And although I have began my path in these things, I haven't begun my path in this area. And so I could simultaneously be trying to maintain my path in these things, while trying to begin another part of that path, which is tahajjud. And so if you imagine a highway, we know the highways have lanes, right? Here we're fortunate, even though it doesn't really do too much, but it does something, that we have 7 lanes sometimes on these major highways. Right? Whereas other areas, in Chicago, it's normally 2 or 3 lanes, and that's it. It's rare to find 4, and if you find 4, it's for a very small, brief stretch of road. And so to envision this, we might have 2 lanes set up, right? And we are on those lanes. But in order to improve our path to Allah, we need to add another lane. We need to do some construction by adding something new to our piety and to our pursuit in spirituality. Also, we know that, at least not here, it's not too much, but in areas that it's colder and gets snow and temperature falls below freezing level, by the time you hit spring, potholes arrive, right? It causes potholes. So in my experience in Chicago, as soon as March, April hits, when the temperatures begin to rise above, and there's already snow and ice, now the ice, because it expands, right, it cracks the road, and when the ice thaws out and then becomes water, it creates potholes, and so that needs to be repaired. And similarly, that's the idea of azm. We are trying to broaden, expand the amount of lanes that we have, all of which are going towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to allow more spirituality, more actions, and at the same time we are trying to maintain these roads, the infrastructure of the roads, so that our pursuit towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala remains smooth. Because nothing's worse than a road that's bumpy. It's really annoying and it's bad for the car and it could damage the car, etc. So we want to avoid that. So Abu Ismail rahimahullah ta'ala defines or says that al-azm huwa tahqiq al-qasd طوعا أو كرها. He defines azm as fulfilling our goal, our qasd. What is our qasd? What is our goal in what we do? Why are we here right now? There's a qasd behind it, an intention behind it. Inshallah, for us, we are hopeful that we are honest in our intention, that we are doing this to sincerely come closer to Allah, strengthen our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it is about fulfilling the goal. Azim, therefore, is kind of the fuel. It's the motor that's pushing us there. It's not the goal itself. It's not the experiences that are required, that are needed to give us motivation, but rather it is the essence of what we are doing, why we are doing it, and then the goal of fulfilling it. Right? طوعا أو كرها. Whether our actions are voluntary or involuntary, or we are coerced into doing it. And this is very interesting. So if I have a goal, right, let's say I have a goal of getting a PhD. That goal is there. I'm the one who put it there. No one coerced me into that. I know sometimes, you as your loving parents, you wanted your children to be doctors and lawyers. And I understand the beauty of that. But most younger ones don't really understand it because, they're coming from a different paradigm. For you, that is success for them. And with success comes ease in life. And you didn't have it as easy as they do. So you understand the value of having a very stable job that brings in a large income. And I try to advise the youth, look, when you choose a major, the culture says choose what you love, do what you love, etc. But guess what? If what you love isn't going to make your home stable, that thing you love will become your greatest enemy. It'll become something you don't love. And so choose a job, not necessarily only because you love it, but it's going to give you the means to build a stable life. And then the things you love doing, do it as a hobby. You have time. You have weekends. You have time after your work, before your work, whatever it is. And make that your hobby. Right? Now, if you can find both in a job, great. Alhamdulillah, for me, I love doing what I do. And alhamdulillah, it provides me with enough to live a very average lifestyle. Alhamdulillah, Rabbil Alameen. But that's not always the case. It's not always the case. So sometimes a person chooses their goal and then chooses to pursue it. Other times, they choose the goal, but they are forced to pursue it. Okay, my child, some parents are, okay, what do you want to major in? I want to major in this. Okay, I'm going to stay behind you until you actually fulfill that, because I know you have this habit of procrastinating, not taking it seriously, so I'm going to stay behind you. So the goal is voluntary, but the pursuit is involuntary. They're coerced into it. And sometimes the goal is involuntary, they're coerced into it, and they're also coerced into pursuing that goal. Now, Abu Ismail is saying, regardless of which of these three you fall into, azm is still there. Azm can still play a role. And an example of that is as follows, a kind of more of an Islamic spiritual example. Sometimes you have a court case. A crime occurred, some problem occurred. You were there, you witnessed it. And now the court is calling you, they summon you. You don't want to go to the court, but they are summoning you, they are forcing you to come. You don't want to stand in front of the court and have to do a testimony using the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Take an oath by the Quran and then tell them what you saw. And knowing the consequences, the repercussions of that, it's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of pressure. And for the sisters, especially the American-born sisters who find a problem as to why a woman's testimony is twice as much as a man, you're lucky. If I had the choice, I'd have it opposite. Because I'd spare myself being summoned. Wouldn't you all, when we get that notice for jury duty, right? What do we do? What do we do? We do everything to try to get out of it. Everything. Why? It's boring. It's inconvenient. And if you get into one of these cases that are 6 months, I mean, that's a huge inconvenience. Why do you want that? So we all try to get out of it. So the Sharia made it easy for you. Made it easy for you. Didn't make it impossible, because sometimes, it is what it is. You have to do this. You're the only one there. You have to speak about it. But in other areas, you have it easy. I'm the one who's going to be called, not you all. I don't want to be called and stand in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But sometimes you're called, you're coerced into it, right? And you're coerced into testifying. Now that doesn't completely nullify the goal here. Because although I am forced to do this, I can still do it with sincerity. I can still do it to the best of my ability, right? For me, this is a job. I have to be here or I'm going to get fired. If I get fired, I can't provide my family. If I can't provide my family, that's a huge problem, right? And so part of the challenge of doing Islam as a profession, teaching Islam as a profession, is that now I have to deal with this aspect of insincerity. That there's this money aspect here. And sometimes I find myself saying, waking up saying, okay, I need to do this because I had to get the paycheck, right? And that's a problem in terms of sincerity. But what we can do is remedy that by saying, okay, yes, I understand that this is part of my job, that I have to do this to get the money. But I don't have to be 100% proficient. I don't have to give it my all. I know I can give it 50%. I can be lazy in how I present you. I don't have to kind of just read it along, and I'm monotonous, and I don't prepare beforehand, and I don't take it seriously. I could do that and still get the paycheck, to be honest, right? But azim, this will, is to say that, no, I'm here, I have a responsibility, I'm going to do my best. And in this we have the very well-known hadith that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves when someone does something, they perfect it. They do it to the best of their ability. That is azim, right? And so sometimes we're coerced into doing something. We're coerced into pursuing a goal, an end result, but that doesn't completely negate will. We can still do it. We can give it our all, and that is our will. And so doing azim can be applied, or azim can be applied and should be applied in all parts of our lives, as I have explained. وَهُوَ عَلَى ثَلَاثِ دَرَجَاتٍ. There are 3 levels here. الدرجة الأولى إباء الحال على العلم لشيم برق الكشف واستدامة نور الأنس والإجابة لإماتة الهوى. So this first level is primarily focusing on this state of mind, this perception, this putting yourself in a spiritual environment. I don't mean a physical spiritual environment. I don't mean going to the masjid where it reinforces spirituality, or going to some sort of Islamic program that reinforces spirituality, but a lifestyle that not only reinforces spirituality, it does it by creating a type of gravitational pull. We need that. Why? Because life is always pulling us. It's always pulling us. And again, sometimes it's by choice. I want to go to this place and have a good time. I want to go and visit my friends and have a cup of coffee. And sometimes we're forced to do it. You get a bill, the hospitals love to do this, right? You pay for a hospital bill, and all of a sudden you get a letter. You have this bill to pay, right? And you paid it, but now they're sending you another bill as if you haven't paid it before. And it's as if it's a game. They're hoping that you pay it anyway, right? But if you call them and say, I already paid this bill, say, oh, okay, it was a mistake, and then They take it away. It's probably happened to you. Something happens with the insurance. You have to call and you have to wait on the line for 50 minutes, and you're forced into doing that, right? And so you have all these forces pushing you and pulling you, and the more forces there are, the more difficult it becomes to be spiritual, especially in our time where spirituality is seen as kind of a joke. That's not what life is. And so we need to build this gravitational force. And so what is it? Well, it begins by iba al-hal ala al-ilm. And what this means is returning our spiritual state upon knowledge. Right? Returning our spiritual state upon knowledge. Now, this statement is ambiguous. What does it mean really? Ibn Qayyim kind of gives the various options. Let's start off with what it doesn't mean, or what it shouldn't mean. Now, whether Abu Ismail meant this or not is we can speculate, but Ibn Qayyim saying that we cannot understand it to be the following, and that is refusing to discipline our spirituality with Islamic knowledge. Right? So what happens sometimes in some of these Sufi circles is that it's all about the inner self and the emotions. What is Islamically good is what feels good, which is very interesting because that's kind of the lifestyle the Western world lives now. If it feels good, then it must be good, and just pursue that, right? And even if the Quran says something contrary to those supposedly good feelings of spirituality, then we need to do one of two things. Either ignore it, and that's not kind of the common thing that to do, or reinterpret it to mean something that coincides and falls in line with what we feel. And so the feelings become the mufassir, the explainer of the Quran, and it becomes the authority of the meanings of the Quran. That's very, very problematic. So we cannot understand it to mean this. It's very problematic, as you see. What it could possibly mean is the following: that our spirituality is disciplined and guided by knowledge. How do I build a relationship with Allah? If spirituality is about a relationship with Allah, how do I build that? It's not random. It just doesn't kind of fall out of the sky. You're not just born with it. You're born with the tools to build it. You're born with the capability of building it. You're born with the fitrah to help you, assist you in obtaining it or attaining it, right? But you need external forces, external resources to actually truly build that structure. And for us, that is Quran and Hadith. And so it is Allah who tells us how our relationship with Him needs to be. And He tells us it is by Islam, submission. Inna ad-deena 'inda Allahi al-Islam. Religion to Allah is Islam, which means submission to Allah. And He tells us how to submit to Allah. It is He who determines and who decides, right, and dictates how to submit to Him. And it is He who dictates what is morally good and what is morally bad. It is He who dictates who is sincere and who is not sincere. But it is upon us to fall within that. That is true spirituality, submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we can only do that via knowledge of what Allah has told us, what the Prophet who represents Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us. Without that, there is no submission. Right? So that's one possibility. The second possibility is that knowledge, right? Knowledge is seen not simply as the externalities of our faith. So when we open up a book of fiqh, it's going to tell us how to pray. It's going to tell us what our body needs to do in order for our salah to be valid. It's going to tell us what our body needs to do in order for our wudu to be valid. It tells us what our body needs to do in order for our fasting to be valid. But fiqh isn't going to tell you, right, what are the spiritual benefits of fasting or of prayer or of ablution. You need to go to what's called al-raqa'iq. So when you look at the books of hadith, for example, there is almost always, especially in the popular books of hadith, the mainstream books of hadith, there's a unit called kitab al-raqa'iq or al-riqaq, the unit of softness, of softening the heart. And it provides you with all of the kind of the spiritual aspects of what we do, right? Of the Day of Judgment, how that is supposed to impact our hearts and our minds. And so what happens all too often is that when we pursue Islamic knowledge, we only, it's pursued as a technical field of study that is only meant to be applied at the physical level. And we tend to forget the spiritual level. Yes, there is the externalities of salah. In order for our salah to be valid, we need to do very dictated or actions that are dictated by Allah. If you don't prostrate twice in each rak'ah, your salah is not valid, no matter how good you feel inside. But at the same time, if my body is just doing those things and my heart is not there, I have lost the essence of salah. If I read the Quran and I read it with beautiful recitation, but my heart isn't moved by the Quran, that's a major problem. And so, iba'ul hal ala al-ilm, one of the potential meanings is that we must return knowledge to the spirituality that it's meant to provide us. Because what's the point of knowing the ins and outs of Islam if it doesn't transform who we are as people? If it doesn't improve who we are? What's the point of salah? Of course, there is a point. That's kind of too broad of a statement, right? The deeper points of salah, deeper goals of salah is about that relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we prostrate, we feel that connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we make dua, we feel it. Asking Allah for certain things, and we've gone over this many times, asking Allah for certain things is great. And hoping for those things to actually manifest is great. But when a person feels that connection to Allah as they make dua, they forget about what they want. It's like, okay, if this comes about, great. But this feeling, this good feeling that I feel when I make dua to Allah, this nearness to Allah that I feel, His presence in my life that I feel, that feels a lot better than my dua actually being answered. Right? So taking knowledge back to the spirituality it's meant to provide us. And if we do that, then there are three types of benefits we get at this first level. Lishiyam barq al-kashf. Right? Lishiyam barq al-kashf. Now, this is a very Sufi terminology or phrase here. And essentially what it means is that kashf is the unveiling. And when we unveil, when our spirituality unveils this relationship to Allah, our connection to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it becomes to where it's as if we see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, some of the kind of extreme, fringent Sufi groups will say, I literally see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But of course, someone like Abu Ismail, rahimahullah ta'ala, a scholar and someone who we consider to be of mainstream, although he has some mistakes, that's not what he means. Not literally see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but it is, as the hadith tells us, al-ihsan أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه فإن لم تكن تراه فإنه يراك. Ihsan is worshipping Allah as if you see Him. Because although you don't see Him, He sees you. So it's not about the literal seeing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but rather the fact that He sees you has become such a powerful force, a powerful influence on your heart to where you always feel His presence. And so that's a concept here. And so what knowledge does is disciplines that. Because what happens a lot when someone is uneducated in Islam, but they are spiritually active, the shaitan plays games with them. And I have gotten emails, and we always see this every now and then. There's some videos of the Haram, of Mecca, right? And they have live stream 24/7, and they live stream every single prayer. And there is one incident where, as they are praying Asr or Dhuhr prayer, some guy charges the microphone of the Imam and starts saying, I'm the Mahdi, I'm the Mahdi. And guess what? There's a lot of people who think that. You'd be surprised how many people I've come across personally who have said, I used to think I'm the Mahdi, or I think I'm the Mahdi. I have had someone tell me, I think I'm Isa, in an email, right? And the stories are always the same. A voice tells me this. A voice is telling me how good I am, to fast and to pray, etc. And that I'm Isa alayhi salam. I tell him, that's the shaitan telling you that. So okay, then why is he telling me to pray and fast? He says, well, if you pray and fast, but you think you're Isa alayhi salam, you have committed blasphemy. And so your prayer and your fast means nothing. So he's using that to pull you to blasphemy. And that's a very, very deceptive plan. Right? He would love to do that and whatnot. And so what happens is spirituality, if it's not disciplined by knowledge, a person can be fooled into feeling these things, And there's some crazy things that go on in some of these extreme Sufi circles, right? And so knowledge needs to come and discipline that. If a person knows that Isa alayhi salam is still alive, right? He's still alive, and that Allah raised him to the heavens, and he's somewhere in the heavens. Either he's in a state of sleep, or he's alive, or he's awake, conscious, right? And that when he returns by descending from the sky. Then this person who thought he was Isa, reborn, like Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, the Ahmadis, right? He said that someone came to me in the dream and said, I'm Isa alayhi salam, right? He was born and he's Isa alayhi salam. Isa isn't reborn, he's not reincarnated. He is who he is, and he comes down. If we have that knowledge from hadith, as hadith clearly indicates, then this spiritual deception, the spiritual game the shaitan plays on a person will not fly, it will not go. When a person knows that the Mahdi, right, his name is Muhammad, the son of Abdullah, he is of Qurashi descent, of the lineage of the Prophet ﷺ, then someone in Sri Lanka, right, these are actual stories, someone in Mirza Ghulam, is he Pakistan or India? Pakistan. Well, no, that's not me, right? So that's how it works. Knowledge will discipline that. But at the same time, we want this unveiling aspect. We want this unveiling of our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but in a way that coincides with knowledge, with Islamic, legitimate, orthodoxy, spirituality. Why? Because if we can worship Allah with ihsan, then we will have this gravitational force that's constantly pulling us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And a simple exercise, which I believe I've shared with you before, and I'll share it here again, is to just put yourself in the moment of the Day of Judgment, standing in front of Allah, looking at your book of deeds. We all, when we do that exercise, what is right and what is wrong becomes very clear. Comes very clear. Should I do this? Should I do that? The choice becomes very clear. And so it is not that difficult to make the right choices, to see the truth. What's difficult is constantly retaining that feeling of being in the moment of the Day of Judgment. What's difficult is constantly reminding ourselves of looking at our book of deeds. And so, Shiyam Barq al-Kashf, right, this unveiling of the spirituality, it's not about the difficulty of understanding what it is, but the difficulty of actually maintaining that and fostering that sentiment. So that's number one. Number two, wastidamatu nur al-uns, and the continuity of the light of uns. This light of uns is the good feeling a person gets when they are in the company of someone or something they love. Right? So when you are with your loved ones, maybe a best friend, a sister, a brother, a parent, your children, whoever, your spouse, your husband, whoever it is, right? When you love someone very much, then when you love someone very much, being in their presence and them being in your presence brings about a type of good feeling. That is the uns. Now we want that uns when it comes to our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And a simple exercise is to remember that time in salah. Perhaps it was Qiyam al-Layl or Taraweeh, the khatim of the Quran, that long dua that we do, that is very emotionally moving, spiritually fulfilling. Right? How do we feel when that goes on? How does Islam feel, Salah feel in Ramadan? Does it not feel a lot better? It does. So there's this uns that manifests during this month, whether that's just from the simple barakah of the month or the sincerity that we have in that month, or this motivation to do a lot of good deeds in that month. Right? If we can retain that uns, then praying isn't about kind of finding the time for it. It's about, I want to do this. Why? Because it makes me feel so good. There's no longer this challenge, should I watch TV or should I pray? Well, praying makes me feel so much better. It's no longer even a challenge. It's not a competition anymore. Right? But how do we get that? And the challenge, again, isn't building it. Ramadan shows that we can all have it. It's not some secret that we need to discover. It's not like you have to go to the gym and work out hours upon hours a day in order to build that sentiment. It's there. Now the challenge becomes, how do we maintain it? How do we maintain the spirituality of Ramadan outside of Ramadan? That's the difficult part. And so how do we do that? Well, we need to look at the spirituality of the knowledge. Because remember, these three elements that we're talking about go back to unraveling the spirituality that comes with knowledge. What is the spirituality of salah? The spirituality of reciting the Quran. And when you look at the books of tafsir, each mufassir has a style of presenting the knowledge, presenting the meanings of the Quran. And all those styles are valid. Sometimes it's a linguistic explanation of the Quran. Sometimes it's explain the Quran through the Quran. Sometimes explain the Quran through hadith, or the statements of the companions and the tabi'een. And sometimes it's by unveiling the spiritual aspects of what's being said. And so in our times today, in fact, probably in all times, when the Quran is presented as a spiritual endeavor, as a spiritual journey, it tends to grasp the person in a way that's far more effective on their iman than to tell them, this is what so-and-so said, and this is what this hadith said. Not to say that those are invalid. Those are valid and very important. But for the common Muslim, what they want to know about the Quran, what is truly impactful about the Quran, is when it has this transformative power on the heart. And what allows that is the spiritual side of the Quran. And this is kind of what we're doing here. Although this is directly engaging the Quran, all of these concepts, Ibn Qayyim takes it from the Quran. He uses the Quran, he uses hadith to critique what Abu Ismail is saying. So the more we are able to unravel the spiritual elements of our faith, the more we are able to build this continuity of this uns, this good feeling of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's company. And then finally, the third is وَالْإِجَابَةُ لِإِمَاتَةِ الْهَوَى. Right? We've mentioned before that the greatest threat to spirituality is desires. And the beginning of this book, Ibn Qayyim begins by saying that there are two things that destroy a person's ability of being transformed by the Quran. One is personal opinion. I don't say personal opinion as my academic opinion after doing the research, after looking into what the scholars have said, my opinion about this verse is this. That's not what I'm saying. But when a person wants the verse to mean what he or she wants it to mean, that is what's meant by what Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah ta'ala means. The second one is desire. When our desire overtakes our understanding of the Quran. Right? However, my statement that desire is the greatest threat to one's spirituality, that's actually not entirely accurate. It's one of the greatest threats to spirituality, but the greatest threat is actually ignorance. Ignorance is Iblis's favorite weakness of the human being. Why? Because desires come and go. Desires come and go. Hunger drives the desire to eat. Eating is a desire. And so fasting Ramadan isn't about experiencing hunger. You know, the most common thing is we fast Ramadan so that we can feel with the poor people. Yeah, that's part of it, but that's actually a small part of it. Ramadan is about abstaining from our desires, the desire to eat, so that we suppress the hegemony of our desires on our life, on our lifestyle. It's not the dominating force. Right? So desires come and go. You're hungry now, later on you're not hungry. You eat, your desire for food goes away. Right? Ignorance isn't something that comes and goes. Ignorance is either there or you're not ignorant. And ignorance is about not knowing. And if you don't know, then Iblis comes, sits in your mind, sits in your heart without you even realizing he's there. So that's the greatest threat. Right? But nonetheless, we're here in desires. When knowledge is used as a spiritual endeavor, according to Islam, what is spirituality? Spirituality is the pursuit of submitting to Allah. And that is exactly the opposite of living a life of desires. It's exactly the opposite. Now, Islam doesn't forbid all desires. It doesn't at all. But what Islam does is says that you are not an animal. You are not an animal. Animals live by desires. They have natural instincts. Why does a lion hunt deer? Or hunt whatever it hunts? Why? It's hungry. And so its natural instincts drives it to hunt the deer. If the lion is full, a deer can walk by the lion and the lion will not do anything. Right? Animals are completely and entirely driven by instinct, which is another way of saying desires. We are not animals. We are not animals. And so in order for us to be human beings, truly human, we must be in control of our desires and engage our desires in a way that is healthy. The Western world is exactly the opposite. Western ideology, the Enlightenment, liberal thought, which I'm doing a lot of research on now, right? It's literally the exact opposite. You are your fullest human self. You can only be authentic when you pursue what you want. And if Allah is not in the picture, divine revelation is not in the picture, which they intentionally exclude them from the picture. In fact, they say that these things oppress you. Allah, the messengers, the book of Allah, the Bible, all this stuff is oppressive to the human being. Why? Because it limits your choices. It limits your natural humanness, right? To want to have a relationship with the opposite gender, to want to do this, to want to do that. So look at where, subhanAllah, when I'm reading this, I'm trying to find out what went wrong according to Islam, right? So that we can be aware of this, because the youth are falling into this. I mean, we live in the Western world. And you cannot but see that when they turned away from Allah, Allah punished them by making them like animals. Now, of course, not everyone in the West, we want to be very clear here. Not everyone in the West is like that. In the West, there are people who try and live by morality, try and live by what's right? But these individuals, these Western philosophers who brought about liberal thought, I'm talking about in the socio-cultural sense, not in the political sense, because that's a different realm. Okay? I mean, whoever follows that, then they have been degraded to the status of animals. There's no difference. They live a lifestyle that's like animals. And what's interesting is that sometimes you find them saying like, well, animals behave like this, right? And so it's normal for human beings to behave like that. And so one of the arguments homosexuals or those who try and promote the notion that homosexuality is something natural for the human being is that they look to monkeys and gorillas and say that they sometimes engage in homosexual practices. And so it's okay for us. Why? Because we are a product of evolution. We go back to monkeys and all of this nonsense. For us, it's not about engaging desires, but rather to Abu Ismail says, to killing off, to dying, to causing our desires to die. But again, this needs to be qualified. Desires that are harmful and or detrimental to our relationship with Allah, to our well-being in the afterlife. Because there are plenty of desires that are not only permissible, they're actually, there's reward in it. So, excuse this example, the Prophet ﷺ says that when a husband and a wife have a marital relationship, there's reward in that. They get rewarded for doing that. And so the companions were confused, like, Ya Rasulullah, I mean, we engage our desires and we get reward for that. He said, would you not receive sins if you were to put it or to do it in a haram way? They said, yes, of course. And so, conversely, if you do it in the halal way, there's reward in that. So we want to be clear here. But desires nonetheless pose a huge challenge on our iman. And so when knowledge becomes a spiritual pursuit, it helps destroy desires. Now, this statement is actually very, very interesting. And a lot is coming to my mind now. You know what? I'm actually going to go into this. Although I wanted to finish this station today. I might not be able to. It's a shorter station, but I think this is very important. When you look at the Western world today, undoubtedly, we cannot deny the huge advancements the Western world has made when it comes to knowledge. Scientific knowledge, statistical knowledge, statistical capabilities. just their ability to dive deep into any subject is truly fascinating. There's a lot to learn, and we should learn from it, right? We are not anti-Western when it comes to the knowledge, but we clearly disagree with some things, right? Now, when you look at the philosophies that have shaped modern Western thought, there are really two strands of knowledge. And to be quite honest, I think these two strands are present in every single society and every single culture. But it's about how those two strands are directed, where they are directed, that kind of we're going to debate. One strand is what's called disengaged reasoning, objective reasoning. And what that means is we completely and entirely remove personal opinion, sentiment from our pursuit of knowledge. Why? Because when that is mixed with knowledge, it tends to be biased, it tends to be inaccurate, and knowledge becomes something about fulfilling what I want instead of coming and reaching the truth. So disengaged reason is about becoming objective. I want to know what the truth is in regards to this thing. But when you look at this ideology, how do they pursue that? They pursue it by trying to understand how we can dominate a particular thing and subjugate it in the way we want it, to manipulate it in the way we want it. So for example, what can I use here? Let's say water, right? Water. We study water as an object in of itself. How do we study it? Well, I want to understand, right? Not necessarily what it is, but what it is in a sense that by knowing what it is, I know what I can do with it. Okay? Now, there's nothing immoral about this per se. Where the concern comes when it comes to Western thought is that the goal becomes solely and entirely, how can I use this? How can I manipulate it in ways where it comes back to benefit my own interest? So what can I do with water? Now, water can be a source of creating energy, for example, right? Nothing haram about that. Hydraulics and whatnot, I don't know the tech here, but I know that water can be split in some sort of chemical way, or you can add certain chemicals to it and to make it. The hydrogen bomb, for example. Water, which is the source of life, can be manipulated by adding certain chemicals, by doing certain things. Again, I don't know the science behind here, so please don't, for those chemists and whatnot, don't get mad at me. Just kind of understand the intent here. They have taken water and made it into a weapon of mass destruction, right? Now, sometimes people will say the reason why nuclear bombs exist and this is as a deterrent, for defense, just in case. There's also another question we need to ask. Why would a person ever think to make something of such destruction in the first place? Does that make sense? Why would I even think to make this? Why would I even think to do this? You coming from the Eastern culture, when you came here, you saw a completely different world, right? And this is called a culture shock. You see things that never occurred on your mind. Yeah. A lot of things. This never even crossed my mind. Yet for here, something very mundane, very normal, right? So what caused them to think of that in the first place? That's a very, very important question. And so one strand of knowledge is how do we manipulate this with the end goals of what they call it buffering the self, making me better. So although it's objective reasoning, it's, let's say, an authentic way of coming to sound knowledge. What is the end goal there? What is the end goal? The end goal is to fulfill my desires. Now the second strand says, no, look, people don't think in terms of reason and logic and all that stuff. The average person does not know the chemistry behind water, right? And if they know that water is compounded of H2 and O, right? They just heard it, they memorized it. What that means is really unknown. What you can do with that is really unknown. How does that affect my body is really unknown. I mean, don't go beyond that. But what every person does know about water is that it quenches thirst. Right? And after running for a period of time and you drink that water, it feels so good. After fasting, especially those first days of fasting, you drink that water, you can feel the water run through your veins. It feels good. And so the second strand of Western thought is about the sentiment. It's not about the science behind this, but the experience this gives me. How does it make me feel? It's not about understanding the geology of mountains, but rather when I'm in the mountains, when I look at the mountains, how does it make me feel? That is the important thing. But in the West, the end goal here is the same as the first one. That feeling is about self-gratification. It's about feeling good. So everything becomes about, well, how does it make you feel? You hear this so much. And watch movies. Pay attention to this in movies, especially more modern movies, especially cultural movies like the Marvel movies, the superhero movies and whatnot. It is full of this. And the reason is the directors and the writers of these movies, they're not uneducated people. They take these philosophies and they incorporate them in these movies, knowing that it is culture that drives behaviors. It is culture. Culture is the means through or from or by which knowledge becomes culture, becomes a standard, it becomes lifestyle, right? No one cares about what Descartes said, what Locke said, what Rousseau said, what Voltaire said. You probably never even heard these names before. But all of the lifestyle of today go back to them. How? It's not because people read their books, but because the elites read their books, and the elites are the creators of culture. Talk about musicians, poets, filmmakers, right? They're the ones who make culture. You know, when the Kardashians wear something, it becomes the fashion. Everyone wants to wear it. When some superstar, when Brad Pitt wears a certain glasses or whatever, right? It becomes the glasses you need to wear. Ronaldo, you see this? This is unbelievable. Ronaldo, two glasses of Coca-Cola. He takes them, puts them aside, and tells people water. He said one word, the stocks dropped $4 billion. Okay, do you understand what this means? How powerful this individual is, that one word caused a multinational, hundreds of billions of dollar company, something that every person consumes. He caused them to get hurt. Can you imagine that? So these elites read these books and then through their cultural means they disseminate them through society. So the second strand is about the experience. How do these things make us feel? That is knowledge. Now guess what? Islam says, أَفَلَا يَعْقِلُونَ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. Right? The Quran presents a lot of logic. Tells us to use our mind. And guess what? The Quran also says, أَفَلَمْ يَسِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَتَكُونَ لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ يَعْقِلُونَ بِهَا. Have they not traveled the lands and see things, see the mountains, and see the previous generations, the previous civilizations that have come and go? And thus that causes something in the heart to understand certain ethics, morals. When we think of the prophets, alayhim salatu wasalam, what does Allah tell us about their stories? We love hearing their stories. Why? It has something here. What Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam did, what he went through, it's not a logical, intellectual journey. It's a story. But it is truly an emotional journey. Because each and every one of us can relate to some part of Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam's life. One part, some part. Some people have lost a child. So they understand the feeling of Yaqub alayhi salam for losing a child for that period of time. Some people are away from their parents because of economic reasons or because of whatever. Life has drawn us apart. And now it is more common for people to be distant from their family than it is to be next to their family. And so they feel how Yusuf alayhi salatu wasalam felt, being in a strange land. You probably felt this when you came here. And so it really plays on the mind, on the heart. But with that comes certain lessons. It improves your character. Quran talks about both. So it's not the venues they pursued, but rather what? The end goal. When we use logic in Islam, when we use emotions in Islam, it is about submitting to Allah. It is about transforming the self to where it helps us build that relationship with Allah. In the Western world, it's about the self, fulfilling the self. Whether it's intellectually fulfilling the self or emotionally fulfilling the self. And so, when Abu Ismail rahimahullah ta'ala says, إِبَاءُ الْحَالَ عَلَى الْعِلْمِ, this is very powerful in our times today. So going back to the example of water, when you look at, subhanAllah, you do see this. Islam is powerful. When you look at the scholars, the Muslim scholars, who are scholars of the what we call the secular sciences. So, Muhammad al-Razi, the very famous chemist, some say the father of chemistry. When you look at the Khalifa al-Ma'mun, who spent a lot of time focusing on astronomy, and he built this very, very powerful, at least for the time, telescope to observe the heavens. The Muslims really liked looking at the universe, and they have technologies to try and determine the distance between the stars, the circumference of the earth back then, using the stars and whatnot. How far is the sun? How large is the sun? They used to do this. And when you look at their books, it's hard to read, but when you look at the beginning, they start off as following: Bismillah, walhamdulillah, min ajaibillah. Among the astonishing things of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That was the culture back then. Knowledge was what? How can I better know Allah through this? How can I better appreciate who Allah through this? Who Allah is through this? How can I better know Allah's names and attributes through this? And this is precisely how the Quran engages nature. Right? Nature has always played a fundamental role when it comes to human civilization, morality, and all the things. I'm not going to get into details here because I'm going over time. Now, the way the Quran uses it is very different than the way the Western world, whether ancient, from the Greek philosophers and whatnot, or more modern, such as the Enlightenment philosophers. Very different. For the West, nature has been the structure by which they develop who they are, their identity, and their morality and whatnot. For Muslims, that's not it. Our identity, our morality is developed by the Quran. Nature is not about developing a certain structure for life. It's not about, because it's not haram to stay up all night. It's not haram to sleep in the morning, right? And so it's not necessarily meant to completely structure our lives, but rather nature is about knowing who Allah is and knowing your purpose in life. That's what it is, right? And I've spoken a lot about nature before. I don't have time to go into it again. So, but I thought I'd show that. Finding the spirituality of knowledge, that is the way of Muslims. Again, it doesn't mean that understanding the technicalities, the objective aspects of water, or the emotional side, the psychological side of water. It's not saying that that's haram. But for Islam, the most important part of knowledge is the spiritual side. And spirituality is, how can this help me get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And so we'll stop there. That concludes the first level of al-azm. Continue the station next week. There's just a few more things to say, but not to make this longer. We'll leave it for next week, inshallah. Sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.